We are now down to the last session for day two, which is a panel focused on innovating the space landscape, which to me is an excellent way to end the day as we have the chance to meet some of the new companies that have entered the space market to advance technologies and commercialize space in unique ways. As they come up, allow for me to introduce our moderator for the panel, Elizabeth Reynolds. Elizabeth is the U.S. Managing Director for Starburst Aerospace. As the Managing Director of Starburst's U.S. business, Elizabeth aligns early-stage technology innovators with government and commercial stakeholders and investors to modernize infrastructure in space, transportation, communications, and intelligence. She and her team, alongside hundreds of technology startups developing new aircraft, spacecraft, satellites, drones, sensors, autonomy, robotics, and much more. Elizabeth brings 15 years of experience in deep tech entrepreneurship, growth, business operations, and strategy to the team. Prior to joining Starburst, she served as an executive for biotech, medtech, mobility, XR companies from founding all the way through IPO. Ms. Reynolds is also a venture partner at the Flying Object and leading development for the new Space Health Fund. With that, I would like to invite Elizabeth and her panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Really excited to be here and talking about innovation today. We've seen the space industry completely transformed over the last 10 years, and we're going to have a great conversation today about the new dynamic ecosystem, innovation, and what the future of the industry holds. So please join me. We've got Colin Dawn from Gravitics, Kelly Hennig from Stoke Space, Lisa Rich from Explore, Josh Western with Space Forge, and Justin Bellucci with Privateer. So I'll let you all kind of take 2 minutes here to tell us a little bit more about what you're building today.
Hi, I'm Colin Dawn, founder of Gravitics. Gravitics is building a US-based module manufacturing facility for space stations of the future. So everything from today's class, 4-meter diameter, very similar to ISS modules, all the way up to the future 8 meters on, say, a Starship-derived launch capability. So US provided, growable over time, so we scale as CLDs and other commercial ventures are ready to scale. We want to be kind of the Boeing, providing the 747 to the United and Deltas that are going to operate these facilities. So we give you growth as you're ready for growth.
I'm Kelly Hennig. I'm the COO of Stoke Space. So I think it's a little funny you mentioned 747. We want to make launch very similar to air flights. So we want to make sure it's rapid, it's routine, it's fully reusable. All of the costs of developing and producing a rocket are borne over multiple flights, and to really democratize and open up the space economy for all the other panelists here. And so we're doing that by creating a fully reusable rocket. We started with our second stage, developed from very unique thermal protection system that allows us to have very high performance as well as do some unique activities in space. We're the fastest moving rocket company in new space. We did seed to engine testing faster than anyone else, and we're continuing to execute. When we're small, but we're continuing to move forward.
Now, Kelly and Colin have talked about rockets and big objects going into space, and our company Explore is on the smaller scale of things, but a bigger scale in terms of the data we're going to bring back from space. That's really our focus. We have an ASPA-sized satellite that's multi-sensor and high-powered that allows us to have many instruments on board to not only have data that we gather, but perform compute capability and edge compute with computers that are doing processing to bring insights back from space. So we do believe that all industries are going to benefit from the data we can bring back from space, and Explore is going to be the company out there gathering that. We have an NRO contract for hyperspectral, and we'll probably have the best hyperspectral in the industry once we fly. Come and talk to us if you want to learn more.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SpaceForge. I'm the one with the weird accent at this panel. We really are an advanced materials company, but our edge is that we happen to produce those materials in space. We've developed a payload solution to produce next-generation compound semiconductors in space. Now, to facilitate that payload, we've also developed return architecture to be allowed to bring them back. So we've been developing the world's first returnable and relaunchable satellite platform, the Forge Star. We had hoped to call it the Star Forge, but George Lucas owns that trademark, and we were two people in a garage, so we didn't want to get into that fight. Our next mission is going up at the end of this year, and importantly, all of the architecture that we've been designing and developing is designed to be inherently scalable. So it works at 50 kilograms, 500 kilograms, and 5 tons. I'm really excited about what the future holds.
Hi, I'm Justin Bellucci. I'm the Senior Director of Engineering at Privateer Space. Our mission is to make space more safe and accessible. We do that a few different ways by providing really sustainable growth in orbit. We have a software and a hardware platform that we're excited to actually share yesterday, the news with everyone. We essentially are building a data infrastructure to aggregate data and make sense of data from space operators, like satellite operators, or data aggregated from other places on Earth and so forth. So we're really trying to target this next few years, space operators, satellite operators, and like Global 2000 businesses to make sense of the data and make it more accessible to not just governments and everyday, hopefully everyday people.
Fantastic. And you kind of just touched on this, Justin, but as we've been talking about commercialization as a major theme everywhere at this conference this year, who are your customers today? Where are you guys seeing the immediate opportunity to offer value, and how do you see that changing over the next 10 years? And if you want to actually start, Justin, and kind of expand on the comments you were just making.
Yeah, typically, space has been the domain of governments and so forth, and we see a future where it's opened up to more than just governments, and obviously that's why a lot of us are right here on stage right now. But our immediate customers are operators of satellites, and really the Global 2000 businesses. But we see that really trickling down when we make data and the insights derived from this data more accessible. Ultimately, we see that opening up to everyday developers, app developers, and so forth. And the future, we don't really know what they're going to build with that data, but if it's more accessible, we feel that they'll do something great with it, hopefully. So.
Yeah,
sure. So we started with our semiconductor payload back in 2018, and then grew very frustrated very quickly because there was no infrastructure available in space for us to go fly that payload, where we were at least allowed to operate it in a manufacturing manner. So we found customers with the second part of what we developed first, which was the Reentry technology, people needing down mass solutions. But that's all changed in the past sort of 4 or 5 months. And that's because by complete accident, SpaceForge has ended up becoming the only producer of compound semiconductor materials in the UK. And we produce very niche materials, which are also useful to our allies in the US and elsewhere. And so we've now somewhat become, somehow, a chip company that happens to operate in space. And that's allowed us to build real resilience in our own revenue streams, because all of a sudden people are interested in the stuff we're doing on the ground, let alone the stuff we'll be doing in space. And I think that's just a really, it's a really interesting part of, perhaps I think, all of our stories here, that it's right place, right time. You're telling the right story just as it becomes important at a national level and an international level. And we've really been able to ride that wave.
I think we've had a wide array of customers since we started our company. We did what a lot of startups do, is securing government contracts with Air Force, NASA, NOAA, DARPA, DIU, which is a wonderful partner for us, and NRO, as I mentioned. We also run a company called, within our company is Major Tom, which is the ability to have ground control operations for your satellites. And we're operating about 20 satellites today, so that's a commercial customer base. But for our satellite that we're launching for Explorer, we expect to have 80% commercial customers when we fly. You've got data aggregators that want to buy data, and then you have governments as well interested. We're talking to the heads of governments in different small countries currently, and they have a great interest in the data we can bring back. So I think that the usual suspects on the data side, most people talk about what are we going to do with this data of Earth observation data, for example, and you're going to see insurance companies and you're going to see real estate companies and all of the businesses that are Earth-based businesses are going to want this data, and Explorer can provide it, and especially on the environmental side, you can look at climate change data that's coming into play. Effectively, all of this data will have a global impact on education, on research and development, on the commercial and the economy partners and government partners. So there's such a wide swath of companies that can work with us and governments that can work with us. It's an exciting path forward.
So everybody on the panel is essentially a customer or a potential customer of ours. And so we just see our customer set growing, and as launch, which happens to be a bottleneck right now, increases and the availability increases, I think our customer sets only continue to grow. And that's very exciting for us to be able to serve so many different types of technologies and needs in space. But one of the interesting things that kind of fell out of our very unique second stage is we hear quite a bit of interest regarding InSpace Mobility, and you can hear from the US government there's some major pushes in those particular types of areas, as well as down mass and being able to bring things back. So that wasn't necessarily something that we focused on, but is a kind of a natural, I guess, outcropping of our unique capability, which sounds like almost everybody is experiencing a little bit here. You're now a chip company. You've got all these different other types of, I guess, adjacent markets that you can pursue. But it's a nice, I guess, complement to our standard launch vehicle.
For Gravitics, obviously, all the CLD players are going to be major customers for us. We have certain other government agencies, sovereign nations, with what the U.S. is doing with creating a robust commercial environment. The rest of the world is taking notice and saying, hey, we may want to have a national capability as well. And so quite a few conversations on that front. And many of you become customers in a way, or at least stakeholders. One of the things we've had a lot of fun talking to some of these groups about is the idea of how do we make it faster to get through pre-commercialization to full commercialization? So right now, the path leads from I get in line, I go to space, I do a cool thing, I bring it down to a well-stocked lab, I analyze the results, and I get back in line. What if I can take that well-stocked lab and take it up to space? Now, over the weekend, I'm doing many iterations of that cycle and dramatically reducing the amount of time to go through potential strong candidates for a commercial product to the point where we do need more launch, more data, more. And that kind of grow the pie is very much kind of the attitude that we have, because the more we do that, the more launch comes down, the easier it's going to be able to have more of the ground-based economy see space as a natural next step and one more market to go after.
I think that's fantastic. And as we talk about this division between government and commercial, the Space Foundation report that came out last week said that commercial revenue is now 78% of the industry. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we continue to sustain this growth. And that can be practically for the support that you need as you build coalitions in the industry to new talent. So what do you think that we need to do today to hit that $1 trillion mark that we're aiming for?
I'll start. Yeah. Obviously, launch is a big piece of it, so thank you. The next piece is going to be we need spaces. We need room on orbit. space real estate for many of these applications. Additionally, looking for places where, Josh, I think you're going to be able to hit this well, we can do things in space and then scale it ground side. I can't wait for the day where just by necessity, everything has to be done in space because that's good for my business. But it can't be the only thing we think of. Sometimes we can get our blinders on in the space industry and only think that way. Is there something clever I can do in space and then take it to the ground to scale? I think we have to be very creative to be able to grow this pie.
I think space always focuses on regulation, and it's kind of boring, but I'm going to go back there. I believe that we need to have our government and regulators and all of this keep track with us. And I think technology is moving incredibly fast. We're looking to shift, quite a bit of manufacturing, data, all these different paradigms are looking to shift massively, and we need to make sure that our government can keep up with how to regulate that and to make sure it doesn't kill us or stall us. And I don't necessarily know that it's on track to provide, to help us. I think it's more trying to get out of our way at this point in time. And I'm just hopeful that they can get out of our way quick enough. But it would be great instead of them, just kind of moving away, that they can actually find a way to really support us and to continue to push us forward so that this explosion that we hope we see actually continues and happens.
Yeah, and to Kelly's point, the regulatory environment, of course, needs innovation, and we need innovation across the board in terms of business models. I think there have been many space companies that are startups that are not thinking about a business model innovation as much as they are thinking about a technical innovation. That's one of the benefits at Explore is we are business-minded people. We approach space from a different angle, if you will, really thinking about not just de-risking business technically, but de-risking from the standpoint of revenue generation, time to generating revenues, different opportunities to go from your main business plan to plan B, plan C. If plan A doesn't work, as you're pivoting, as you've done with your company of where is our new commercial business going to land, you have to be agile. And so I would say for the economy to really be growing commercially, we need more companies thinking about a business model innovation for their company because the old ways weren't working. We've seen the devastation of many space companies that have, a trail of tears for prior companies that haven't made it. We want to see more companies succeed. We need the resiliency of this environment to really be bolstered by stronger companies, not just the startups that are having a successful business plan, but also startups that understand how to collaborate with other companies to acquire, to join forces, to partner, because that is how we can fuel this sector forward. We need that partnership environment, that companies joining together so that we have more mid-sized businesses versus small and then prime. We need everybody in between. So it takes all of us to achieve that.
So I actually come from a politics background and then sales jobs. So I come from this with always asking the question, okay, who's actually going to pay for that? And also coming from Europe, if your answer is government, then you don't have a business. What I think really we've been able to do as Space Forge is because we consider ourselves to be this materials business, because we are effectively providing micro-orbital factories, we're able to get our hooks into industries which are either already worth $1 trillion or are very close to being worth $1 trillion. Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, alloying, ceramics, even glass, whatever it might be. And so we're looking to either become a slither of some of those pies and help expand out from what's right now very nascent technologies into growing them to be significant, or we're helping them to develop entirely new materials which replace things we've had in operation since the 1950s, like the move from silicon to things like silicon carbide. But we also have the added benefit that SpaceForge Inc. is only 8 weeks old. And we've really been able to hit the ground running with everything we've learned and we've brought from the UK and from Europe. But we also have been able to bring that mindset that anybody that thinks space is only as big as one company is lying. We all have to be able to work together, whether or not that's, we go and find a launch partner and we get somebody to help build part of our bus and then we do the things that we're good at. Whatever sector of the space industry you work in, it's bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think that's so important to remember when it comes to growing this industry and the space economy. And I think that actually allows us to hit this trillion valuation so much faster. And I think actually this conference has been a fantastic way to demonstrate this, because so many you go to traditional aerospace and defense conferences and you've got the primes sort of eyeing each other dodgily. Here, everybody's just like, how do we work together? How do we do this? How do we make this gene therapy experiment happen? And how do I get it down in 10 days? And how do I make it survive launch? And all of these things. And it's just so exciting to be part of that conversation than it is part of that competitive landscape instead.
What you just said really hits on what our mission is. I think it's, as we get more and more assets into LEO and more businesses growing, large and small and so forth, we believe that step one is for sustainable growth and really have, being able to operate in orbit, and collaborate and know who's in your way and being able to navigate and, in some sense get out of the way or move around into another orbit and so forth. So Privateer, for one, is really trying to build those tools to allow everyone to collaborate and operate safer in these orbits. Because I think there's going to be a tipping point at some point. We're not going to keep being able to launch assets into space and in at least lower Earth orbit and immediate orbit without there to be dire consequences. I think one of the major roadblocks is actually just that sustainable growth barrier that we need. I don't like to use the word regulation necessarily, but we need some set of guidelines, data to inform us that how do we operate safely in space.
Sure. And we were talking about regulation, and I think one of the few areas where many people want more regulation is around debris and management in space. Talking about the transition of the ISS and looking at this conference and the discussion we've been having today, thinking about that and regulation, what role do you want government to have in this new space economy? And where do you think we can play together best?
The government should be a buyer of services. Traditionally, they've been a buyer of hardware, and that's been changing. We'd like to see more opportunity there, and that requires innovation and contracting.
Some on-ramps for programs that are already established, where new entrants can continue to innovate, and when they think they're ready for being judged by whatever criteria good looks like, there's opportunities to join those programs, and that they don't have to magically hit the start of their company with exactly when NASA or whatever government agency is ready to buy. That more of an open approach, I think, could be very powerful for continuing to welcome new entrants, and frankly, by the government buying a service or product and then continuing to do so, they're establishing a market that will then actually justify VC-backed startups to engage, because there is a market they can go after. But if effectively that contract is now shut down to them because the winners have already been chosen for some extended window, it makes it difficult to get the new blood in there. It's almost backwards.
I want to second that and almost add to it that a lot of times the government doesn't want to pick winners and losers, and they see their role as much more of letting the commercial market kind of play out and then allowing people to unramp. But in actuality, when they have these types of contracts that require very specific on-ramp timeframes as opposed to the rolling, like Colin was describing, they are inadvertently picking winners and losers. And it's a very clear signal to investors who they should invest in and how much momentum you have. And so the ability for new space companies to be able to be pulled onto these contracts, announce it, and show that there is, government momentum behind them, I think is huge. And so I definitely agree with that. I also think that there, especially for launch, and that this is going to be specific to launch, I do think that there is some investment that the government should continue to look at. It is a incredibly important part of their defense industrial base. And they've spent years actually, they've spent decades in developing various types of launch vehicles. But right now they're still limited. They still have a huge threat in how much launch they can do, how responsive they can be, and they don't have very robust players. And so I do think that they need to relook at how they invest in launch and how they make sure that that industrial base is fairly robust so that they can have the access to space that they need. And so if that is through not necessarily R&D type funds, but if that is through some of the Title III funds that they typically divvy out to these types of players to kind of bridge that gap, I think that that's what they need to look at as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I speak to what I think about the government. I think inevitably the governments are going to have to get involved with this in some sense. All I could say is that I think there needs to be they need to understand what's happening, to be able to make decisions and in some sense about how to operate and how to build regulations around that. I think having data on that and it will help them be more informed in some sense. So I really think it's important for, I think inevitably there will have to be some government oversight and coordination between different nation states and so forth. And having the data to help inform what those guidelines and regulations are, I think is probably the most baseline thing that we can do, right? As companies be able to provide that.
I don't think it's fair for me to have an ask of US government. However, I would say more holistically, because of the way that we operate our reentry vehicle, we have effectively already become a global organization. We've established reentry return locations in the UK, in Europe, in Australia. Inc. will allow us to do it in the US. But not one of those organizations has a shared regime or one that matches the other. So our first returns are actually being conducted to Portugal because they have a vast amount of the Atlantic as their air and sea space. But they've also been incredibly friendly because they are so desperate to build their own space capabilities in their own space industry. They've even offered us the deployment of the Portuguese Navy to assist us with our recovery operations. Like, hell yeah, I'm going to take that. If I get to sit on a frigate, I'm going to do it. But I think as well, in the conversations we've been having around this arena, we've also very quickly hit limitations. So if we take debris removal, for example, I'm incredibly bullish on the opportunity, but I do not think debris removal goes far enough. It's like saying we've solved the landfill problem because we're now dumping all of the plastic in the sea. Yeah. We have that impact if we only send things into a graveyard orbit and we only send them up into our atmosphere and burn them up and do untold damage at those upper layers of our atmosphere because we simply don't know because nobody's been bothered to ask the question until very recently. The technologies like what Stoke are doing, like StarMax, like what we're doing at SpaceForge, I mean, fundamentally, you can change that equation for the first time ever. You can bring something back, and even if what you bring back is warped and twisted and entirely defunct, at least you can appropriately put it in a landfill and leave it there, rather than worrying about what it might be doing elsewhere. And that's where I'd like to see much better regulatory and wider global government engagement.
Yeah. As we talk about governments, I do think that the international perspective is really important. We are seeing a lot more interest in space from every sovereign nation today. It has become a really key piece of national security. As we think about national security, government spending has historically defined the growth of the space industry. The commercial industry obviously has many different drivers and forces that dictate how it functions. How do we protect national interests in this environment? And we'll let you give a UK perspective as well.
Come to me last.
You want to start us off, Colin?
Sure.
Yeah.
There are tremendous opportunities with the more we work together, the easier it is to hit some national security objectives, which is a little bit interesting to think that way. More launch gives us more flexibility. The greater amount of use of constellations, the less vulnerable any one satellite is. So the very act of pushing towards commercialization in many ways makes war less likely to occur in the heavens, and we're safer as a result of it. And it forces our governments to look for alternatives for national security objectives. And for these in the room, that is a very good thing to kind of take those crosshairs off of the sky as the place where those battlegrounds are going to occur. So there obviously are still going to be huge needs for data, and those are absolutely very stovepiped around national boundaries. Huge needs around launch, capabilities for edge computing in orbit, eventually then around the moon and other places. So lots of places where this push towards commercial gives the government fresh capabilities for what they want to do in orbit, hitting these national objectives. I'm excited the fact that with commercial pushing into this, we can do it in ways that are actually, I think, take us back a step from the edge of a cliff where it's just everybody pointing at each other with sharp, pointy sticks. That is just not helpful.
So I jump in, but I think you said launch like 5 or 6 times, so what Colin said.
You can talk about large modules in space then.
I don't know which angle to take this question because it's such a big question about international, but from the U.S. perspective on data, we were able to, at our company, have a license that's, get our licensing taken care of in advance of a launch, so great. But thinking about international customers, I know when I go to DC and visit for legislative folks, senators, congress people, they all say, are you going to do business with, bad nations and that type of thing? Of course we're not. I know that's not something that, but they're asking that question. But from a growth perspective for commercial, of course, the RTAR question always comes up. Are we giving away our entire satellite business to non-US countries because of the high level of requirements on ITAR that make the supply chain nearly impossible in the US, and US providers to provide low-cost components is very, very difficult. So that's a hurdle we have to deal with. We don't have, if you look at a laptop today, the components in that laptop are not from the US. So what's going to happen in the future to our satellites? That business is walking away from us right now.
You all hit on a lot of points. I mean, I think from a national security standpoint, I mean, I think, again, just having more transparency to data and from satellites and gathered will hopefully, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, because having more data transparency, I think, is really important, number one. I mean, I think that's, there'll always be government interests that'll be secret, and then, the commercial side will open up, and hopefully, just that more transparency will allow us to, like what you said, work more collaboratively and, come up with solutions cross boundaries, maybe.
I mean, from a national security perspective, I think you can only achieve national security with shared security. Yeah. And I don't just say that because I'm from the UK, but I mean, if you you can look to broader alliances like Five Eyes, newly emerging ones like AUKUS or the Quad, and they've all got a nickname. But I think, you know, the relations that we have with those countries just run so much deeper than security ties. You know, we have loads of McDonald's in the UK, the same way that occasionally you can find something that calls itself a British pub in the US. And you have those opportunities to create shared history and shared relationships deeper than those security relationships. And I think that's so important to the way that we think about national security today. I have to be careful not to use imperialist language, speaking as a Brit, but the opportunities that we have is that, you know, fundamentally the US has different relationships to what the UK has, and the UK has different to what Canada has, and Canada has different to what New Zealand has or Australia has. And in fact, actually, you can bring all of those relationships together. So if I take, you know, a pretty contentious country at the moment, Singapore, from a national security perspective, refusing to pick a side. But the UK has a very long shared history with Singapore, so it's an ally in a relationship and a defense partnership that's very strong to the UK and very important one that we access all of the time. And it's those arenas where actually I think you're going to see a lot of this national security considerations start to take shape. You know, so how do you work with a Singaporean supply chain, let alone a Chinese or a Taiwanese? And I think those things are actually going to start shaping the narrative a lot more in this sort of, I guess, newly emerging discourse around what national security now looks like in a sort of post-CHIPS Act environment. But I would make one case, definitely let the UK into more CHIPS Act activity so we can help you guys out.
Actually, you mentioned CHIPS Act. Is it? Yes. So going back to what Lisa said, I think there's some fantastic parallels between that and just overall microelectronics and what happened with the CHIPS Act. The government put a huge amount of money in various R&D efforts in order to bring up our microelectronics capability in the US. Commercial took it over, dumped massive amounts of money into it, and the government kind of stepped back a little bit and let them run with it. And very, very soon, the government wasn't really paying attention, and all of a sudden, all of the very, very, you know, deep submicron technologies that the government needed for their national security assets were offshore. And it happened very, very quickly, and then there was a massive, I would say, panic about how do we respond to this and how do we act to this. And microelectronics are incredibly capital intensive, so you know, the government setting up its own kind of foundry in order to address this was just kind of out of the question. And so you took a massive piece of legislation like the CHIPS Act, which was in work for probably about 15 years before they actually could get it together and start responding to that particular threat. So, you know, if, you know, not necessarily massive government kind of regulation or investment, but they have to keep an eye on it so what Lisa mentioned actually doesn't happen to our various capabilities that we need for space.
Did you want that?
Oh, just that it's history is repeating itself.
Yes.
To Kelly's point.
Yeah.
And so what is happening now in policy to take that on? We have discussions with the State of Space Industrial Base Group, and we talk about it, and we talk about it.
And you talk about
and
it.
we talk about it. So there's awareness, but not any kind of act underway as far as I understand. But I will say the emphasis on trying to get to dual-use technologies across the board, the understanding that's kind of proliferated with different agencies that they understand they need to be thinking about dual use, that's been helpful to the industry. That is a new type of thinking. Even though it comes naturally to us, it's new to government.
Yeah. Thinking about kind of some of the challenges around policy and the way some of these larger macro trends kind of develop, I think it's important to kind of talk about public perception of the space industry. People still are a little skeptical or sometimes don't understand the real value of the space industry, either for them directly, for Earth as a whole, for national security. How do you guys think about this as a problem? How do you communicate that what you're doing is really important and valuable to the public? And what more do we need to do as an industry?
A very similar question was asked of the NASA administrator on a panel I was at a few weeks ago at Blue. And the conversation came back to representation. And I think it's worth, although I'm stealing thunder from people that participated there, it's worth mentioning here again, that idea of a subset of the next generation that can't see someone like them makes it really hard for them to follow. So there's a part of what we need to do as an industry to keep pushing on making sure that those people in authority, that the young girls and young boys of the next generation are seeing people like them in aspirational roles for them. They can be the astronaut, they can be the CEO, they can be bald men need more representation. No, that's not the point. That's not the point. That has to be a big piece of it. There will always be an element of this job that is, people get excited when hot, flamey stuff comes out of a rocket and they get to launch and then they forget about it until they get GPS and now their car works great and they forget where it comes from. That will always just be kind of one of the bum parts of this job. And that's okay. We need to be pushing on how do we actually make humanity better. I'm loving so many of the slogans that I'm seeing that appear to be getting that point of keep mentioning, no, I'm doing this crazy thing out in space for the benefit of people right here at home. Making that tie to sixth graders is hard. They are still excited, and I think that the most excited they get is when they can see that I could be doing that. And that's, I think, where that representation piece comes in.
So it's a little bit funny you're saying that, and she's going to kill me later, but I brought my daughter.
I'm so glad you did. That was awesome. That was awesome.
My 12-year-old daughter there. But I do agree with it. I do think general STEM education is huge.
Yeah.
People should know why their phone works and why it takes them places. I mean, those are some fundamental things that we are failing as a society if we don't understand that. Yeah. And I think, in general, just overall STEM education to help explain how simple things work and how space impacts our everyday life, I think is huge. And so talking about it and not dumbing it down, not catering to that, but instead elevating the conversation and continuing to talk and about these types of things and force that kind of STEM conversation, I think is huge. And I think we should continue to do it, and hopefully other people do it as well.
We get glimmers of space in the news beyond a rocket launch when the Ukraine-Russia situation, you see imagery coming back from satellites that's showing conflict areas, and then that's in the news, and somebody could see that and say, oh gosh, did that come from a satellite? Is that what's flying above my head? I have a favorite dumb free app that I share called the Satellite Pointer, and you hold it up and it shows every satellite that's flying over you right now. And every time I have the opportunity to talk to someone that doesn't know anything about space, I pull out my phone and I show them the satellite pointer and I say, look what's flying above your head right now. And they see that it says, these are all of our satellites that are streaming our movies and DirecTV and that type of thing. But at least it's some understanding that there's this connectivity between you're standing here, that's what's flying over your head right now. And people are amazed. It's the simplest thing, and yet this is the problem the industry has, is you cannot see it. But the other challenge we have is, what does that satellite do? They don't necessarily know. So I take every opportunity to try and explain what different satellites beyond the communication satellites are performing in space, and other satellites like Explorers, when we're up there, we'll be able to have that data and talk about what hyperspectral does. For example, that we're looking at the chemistry of the Earth. What does that tell us? It's very cool. I think kids are going to really start learning more and say, I could learn that from this satellite that's flying above my head, and that can tell me more about the land and plant health and water usage, all these different things. But it's not talked about enough right now, I think, because you're not seeing it in the news, but at least you're seeing some satellite images for sad reasons, but, you know, or the barge that was stuck at the, I'm trying to think of just some, here and there, satellite images that appear in the news. But it's sparse right now. I think it's going to proliferate, and that's a good thing.
I would really like to come off of that. So I grew up in farming country. Wasn't much to do, but the stargazing was good. And the reason I tell you this is because my brother's a farmer, and it wasn't until I got into the industry did he understand that the sat in sat-nav stood for satellite. And at the same time, you know, I'm not from the US. When I was at university and I was graduating, 2014 I graduated. That was the same year Tim Peake, the British astronaut, was selected for his mission to the ISS. And I went, oh, we have a space industry. You mean I don't need to be American? I don't need to join NASA as a payload researcher or whatever the job is you're allowed to do under a different passport. And I literally Googled British space companies. I found one and I wrote to the CEO and asked for a job interview. And that's how I got into the sector. Like entirely very interesting job market at the time. But because the British space sector was always calling out for people because it was so hidden. And I think really to touch on, Colin, what you were saying around the need to be mission driven. So I'm incredibly passionate about space for climate. And what frustrated me when I was working at one of the primes was when they said, you know, everything we do is about climate. How do we save the planet? And actually all their satellites ever did was point out a problem existed. You know, when you monitor Earth and you look for climate disasters, you're looking for deforestation, you point to an oil spill in the Gulf, whatever it might be, you still need a solution on the ground to go solve that problem. You need people to go plant more trees, you need people to go clean up the oil spill, whatever it is. Something like we do with InSpace manufacturing is the first opportunity we've got looking at the two things we haven't really been using in space. It's microgravity and it's high purity vacuum. Allow us to produce things on orbit which directly address those challenges only if we can bring them back to Earth and start implementing them. So when I think about how we get that story across of how space gets more involved and becomes a bigger part of the public discourse, it's about how space starts to become so much more than us talking to ourselves. And it's instead, for me, how that chip that we made got put into a 5G cell tower and reduce the amount of energy it used by 50%. Like those are the conversations that I want to be having.
Yeah, I think we're at a really exciting time now with, you know, moving away from government and then billionaires getting into space. And you know, over the next 10 years, you know, hopefully by, you know, opening it up in some sense, it's gonna, you know, proliferate down to, you know, the younger generation. I think it's like, we personally are trying to make it, in some sense, like bridging the gap between Silicon Valley and, you know, space, making it cool in some sense. I mean, I hate to use that word, but like, you know, it's been in the realm of governments, and I think just, you know, like you all said, with the younger generation, opening it up to, you know, the possibilities of what you could do with the data, not just like, you know, we're looking at hurricanes, you know, and so forth that are just plowing through, you know, the countryside, but like we're doing real actionable items with that data, and really, I think number one is just making that data accessible and showing it in fun ways, and I think just opening that up to more people hopefully will, you know, inspire the next generation, you know, follow our footsteps.
Yeah. As we talk about the next generation, I know talent shortage is something that has been on a lot of people's minds as we see all this growth in the industry. As we talk about Silicon Valley and we see, you know, digitization creating a lot more competition between, you know, space industry and more traditional tech companies. Is that something that you guys are experiencing, and how do you want, like, what are you doing aside from kind of, you know, STEM education and those longer term visions? What are you doing today to kind of attract people and bring people into your companies?
I think one of the things that I like to do is talk to the Fortune 100 companies that have R&D teams and ask the question, what is your space strategy? How are you preparing your business to take advantage of the data and the changes that are happening in the space sector. And they're not generally thinking this way. They're not having their think tank conversations around it because every business, in our view, will be a space business in the future. So I like to say it's too early before it's too late to start thinking about it. Just like in the internet days, if you weren't thinking about this advent of the internet and you weren't thinking about how is my company going to benefit from this, and then the internet occurs and you didn't think you needed a website, you didn't think you needed to transition your brick and mortar business to a digital space, then you're left behind. So there should be more strategy going on in conversations around how a business is going to transition and leverage themselves, position themselves in a different way because of the time we're living in right now. What happens when Starship launches and we have Kelly's Stoke launching and big mass is going, up mass is changing the whole calculation of what you can achieve in space.
I wanted to sneak on an ISSRDC panel and talk to an entire audience about applying for jobs at gravitics.com. Yeah. So all of you are welcome. We'd love to have you, especially looking for some GNC experts, so come on. In general, it's tricky for a startup, but also easier. The tricky part is that you're looking for entrepreneurs who are risk takers, willing to go against the general flow of being a cool cog in a big machine and kind of going along with what your buddies are doing to saying, hey, I'm going to take a little more risk and do something different. But that also is on the good side because I can usually award with stock options and give other incentives that can compensate for that risk. And so we have this give and take with government agencies for talent. I'm talking to some of the CLD players, and they obviously pulled from NASA heavily as they were getting ramped up. But now they're several years in, and they're giving back to NASA. And people are leaving those companies to now say, hey, I've got 2 or 3 years of great experience, and now I want to go back in and say how I can have an influence on that setting up the next programs because I got to live it in there. So I think there's still a symbiotic relationship. The question just comes down to, are we graduating enough engineers? And can we actually grow this pie fast enough? So that's still a challenge.
So having, gone to school and started engineering school, I'm not going to say when, but before this explosion in commercial space, I remember this latent frustration with the limited number of jobs that existed in space, and how you wanted to, you saw the movies, and you super passionate about it, and you wanted to have some sort of role in it, and you just couldn't find it, and it was sad and it was frustrating. I think this explosion that we're seeing and this growth in the industry from when I went to school is massive, and there's so many hungry new people graduating every day who love the idea of working in space. And I think we have a huge influx of interns, and they're so passionate and they're so creative and they are awesome. And so I'm very optimistic about this new talent that is coming into the industry. I do think that there are some skills, as you mentioned, that are hard to find, and they are in high demand, and getting them can be challenging. However, just the idea of what we're doing and being able to kind of channel that passion and capture the imagination, I think working in a startup in space, that is a huge benefit that we have. And being able to, we're developing software, and we're developing an inventory tracking software that allows us to build through manufacturing. And we're starting that up. It's helping us build our rockets, and we're launching it and then selling it. And the software engineers who are working on this, SaaS are so excited about the fact that they're working on a rocket company, right? And so, yeah, they're working on this other piece of software, but the idea that they're touching it and they're part of the launches and they're part of this tech development, they're just so excited about it. And I think carrying that forward and being able to utilize that passion is key.
I mean, please.
Just Explore has a lot of job opportunities too, and it's a different mindset, as you were saying, in startups. It's the individual with a willingness to be in a collaborative environment, to be in an agile situation where you can be growing, learning all the time. There isn't necessarily one finite role that you fulfill, and so I think we want to see more prospective job applicants that are looking for that moment where they can really apply themselves and challenge themselves. And that's a different mindset than other types of jobs working for big companies. So that's been a challenge, is finding people that understand really the startup environment, I think. Here in Seattle specifically. We're all in Seattle, so I'll speak to Seattle. There you go.
Our philosophy at SpaceForge is we can't teach you to be a nice person, but we can teach you to be an engineer. So we start by looking for nice people, and then we see whether or not, if they're, what we really assess to be a cultural fit. Do they have the technical expertise or the willingness to learn that technical expertise to join us? So the one thing that we don't do is we do not prescribe space experience when looking for somebody to join us. So for example, our head of electronics, until quite recently, was building synthesizers for very well-known 80s bands like Tears for Fears and Depeche Mode and that sort of stuff. She's also very good at playing synth herself. But the real difference between engineering on a satellite or a spacecraft and engineering on anything else is just you have to wear a funny suit to go do it. And because we've taken that approach, we've created such an open environment to where we're hiring in both Inc. and in the UK, that we often don't recognize the problems that some of the wider industry or the older industry, in terms of the more established older space companies, are having when it comes to retention and recruitment. So in fact, we've just put out a job ad for a sort of mid-career mechanical engineer. And for the one post, we had 171 applications. And before that, we did a manufacturing engineer, and we had 151 applications. And before that, we did a GNC engineer, and we had 130. And before that, and before that. And every time we go out to recruit, we continue to be astounded at how many people want to come work with us. And it sort of brings it back to that earlier question we had around being mission-driven. And we think because we put that front and center of everything we do, and it's not a sort of lazy, if you put a scraper to it, would just underneath say return value to shareholders, like we actually believe it and we actually go do it, people buy into that journey. And we almost sometimes have the opposite problem, that we don't really have any churn. So in the 50 or so people that we've become, we've only had one person leave SpaceForge. And that's been a real surprise to me, because I'm so used to working in environments where people were coming left, right, and center and leaving all of the time. So it's been a journey.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons, we attract, so far we've attracted good talent. Our headquarters is in Maui, Hawaii. So, I think that's a positive attribute of working for us. We've been lucky, though, with our co-founders, Steve Wozniak and, Alex Fielding and Morva Jha. We haven't had trouble, attracting talent. But I think that one of the biggest things that we try to do, at least on Maui, for the Hawaiian community and so forth, we do a lot of outreach. Our engineers, a lot of my team over there does outreach to STEM education. They talk and they try to get kids excited about it from that level. And then we have a great intern program where we've had awesome interns over the last few years. And we've hired some of them. They've done lots of heavy lifting for us for a little pay, which is great. But I think in general, kind of like you said, I have zero space experience prior to coming to Privateer, but I think we look for people that don't necessarily fit in the same box that the industry has put people in. Prior to this, I founded a company that we built sensor systems for commercial beekeeping, right? It's very different, right, than the space industry, but it's also very similar in some sense. So it's like, I think, trying to just have an open mind coming into the industry. Startups are very different than working for real large companies. I think I would love to eventually put myself out of a job, like grow the company big enough that, we need somebody that has more experience at a company that has thousands of people, right? And so I think I'm really excited about that journey that we're taking, and I think, so we're hiring too. Please come work for us.
I'll join.
Yeah, I love it. So we only have about 5 minutes left. I don't know if we've got time to do a quick question or two.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of questions here. So the first one is kind of touches upon what was spoken about before. So how do you think the government space agencies and the private sector can work together to support new space startups?
I'll give a British view.
Everybody's waiting.
So the UK Space Agency budget over the next 5 years is 1.84 billion. That's one NASA contract. It's a good contract, but it is literally one NASA contract. So coming from that landscape forces you to be finding commercial traction with like non-government sources much faster and at a much earlier stage of your technology development than is often available to the US. At the same time, because of that, I again take benefit from the fact that we have Europe and we have the European Space Agency. And like that's who we look to be our NASA from that standpoint. For a start, they give you contracts, not grants, which is always music to my ears as much as it is to our investors. And they are also able to adopt a technology horizon and a program horizon that is devoid of the political constraints that we find in the UK with our national politics and the way that agenda gets set every 4 or 5 years. And so that forces you to go out and build this commercial stuff. So very quickly, we learn as Space Forge what does work and what doesn't work. And if you go into a chip company and you say, hey, I want to make chips in space, are you interested? No, they're not. The answer you get is no, that's way too expensive. If you instead go, hey, come look at our really cool new material or substrate, and they go, oh, that's cool, where did you make that? And you go, well, I made that in space. All you do is you just subvert the narrative, but you get them on board much faster because you can already start to demonstrate that. So I'm not really sure if I help answer that question, but that's at least my approach to it.
I've been beating a drum for a few years. When Thomas Zurbuchen was at NASA, we talked about a roadmap to commercialization with him, and one of our comments was about the CLIPS program, which does not stand for Commercial Lander Payload Services. It stands for Commercial Lunar Payload Services. However, the CLIPS program has only been distributing money for landers. We need landers, we need orbiters. And the reason this is interesting to me is our satellite is designed for the ability to go to observe the Earth, but to go to cislunar space, Moon, Mars, Venus, and beyond. We have a highly capable satellite we've designed. We're looking to fly it. We'd love to be part of the CLIPS program in the future if it was lunar payload services, not lander payload services. So that's just my 10 cents.
All right, do we have time for one more question?
And there is one more question, I guess requesting advice on how for space startups to compete for capital in the US. Like, what do startups need to do to be competing, in the US for capital versus other sectors?
I think that's a great question.
For government funding or private equity?
I think we could reframe that as, what advice do you have for entrepreneurs? Yeah.
Government funding is hard and difficult. It takes a long time. I mean, I think I'll start this. I think a really good business case, really good, and also really talking to customers, doing a lot of customer research initially, I think will help, secure funding, and having a passionate team, it's all about the team, to be honest.
And in knowing your customers, being able to tell your story to those customers as well as the investors, understanding it, getting it very crisp, and understanding how you need to relate to them and how you need to tell your story. It's all about your story, it's all about your narrative, your thesis, and being able to tell that in a very clear, concise way that captures their imagination is critical.
Also, understand who you're going to be working with at the different stages of investment. So early on, it's all about who's on the bus, the people, because they're going to say, well, it's a cool idea, but even if the idea ends up being garbage and they have to pivot, those humans are the right humans that should be able to pivot to something cooler. But there's going to be this transition. Those early investors are going to take huge risks with you, and then they're going to look for that market traction. And that's where that early customer discovery is so critical. And you've got to prove that you can do what you say you can do and that somebody wants what you say you can do and will pay money for that. And so that next stage up, kind of A and beyond, you really have to be able to say, okay, I've got the team, I've got the idea, oh, look, I've got the contract. And that's really where things start locking in, where there's less flexibility for the easy pivot. The investors that are going to join you at that stage are going to be expecting far more as far as financial results, where before it could be anecdotal. Ooh, cool, I made this fun thing. Wow, that's amazing. Now it's all about, look, I'm hitting my KPIs, et cetera. So that natural growing up of a startup, it's important to kind of know those stages as you get in, to know what stage you're on, how much money you need to go through each stage. Which kind of investor are you speaking with? Is this one that is going to be perfect, but for a later stage or an earlier stage than where you're at? Know those landscapes and know the pathway through the multi-stages for you to be successful.
And what they need at each stage, what they're expecting to see in your pitch and how you're expected to communicate with them, I think is key. And I agree with you 100%. It completely changes. It morphs as you as you grow up. It completely does. And you also hit on something else. The promises you make and what you sign up for, you're going to be measured against it. So you need to execute. You need to figure out how to do that and how to do that well.
All right, we're out of time. I really want to thank everybody. I believe we're all going to go hang out at the reception after this. So if you've got questions, come find us there. Just as a final note, be mission oriented. The work you guys are doing is really hard. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.